Welcome to Morbid Matters, where we discuss all things from the horrors of history to the true crime of today. Basically just anything that's macabre or morbid. That's this channel. Today's story is about the one and only Albert Fish, who in my opinion is probably one of the most disturbing serial killers I've ever come across, just because of how mentally deranged and perverse he was as a person, as well as the victims he chose, who were almost exclusively very young children, and on top of that, he was a cannibal, which just adds an extra layer of taboo to his crimes. So because of the sensitive nature of this case, I will be having to censor some of the things I say on here because of YouTube's terms of service, so if I'm not using proper terminology or abbreviating things, that's why. Also, a word of caution, this case does involve horrible crimes against children, so if you don't want to continue for that reason, I totally understand. But with all that being said, let's get into the morbid crimes of Albert Fish. So, Fish was born on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. to his parents Randall and Ellen. Randall was of American and English ancestry, and Ellen was of Scottish and Irish ancestry. Randall was also 43 years older than Ellen, which made him 75 years old at the time of Albert's birth. Fish was the youngest child and had 3 older living siblings named Walter, Annie, and Edwin. Fish's original birth name was Hamilton Howard Fish, but he wanted to be known as Albert after a sibling who had died in early childhood, and it was also to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs, which he was given at the orphanage where he ended up spending the majority of his childhood, which we will get into that in a moment. Fish did have a pretty significant history of mental illness in his family. His uncle had mania, which is a type of bipolar disorder. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction as well. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother was known to have visual hallucinations. Fish's father, Randall, who worked as a fertilizer manufacturer, suffered a fatal heart attack in 1875 when Albert was only 5 years old. Although keep in mind, Randall would have been 80 years old at this point, so him dying of a heart attack shouldn't have came as a huge shock, I would think. But since Randall was the main breadwinner for the family, Fish's mother Ellen could no longer afford to take care of all of her children, so she ended up putting Albert in St. John's Orphanage in Washington. He was routinely physically beaten by the staff at this orphanage, but over time Albert actually began to enjoy the physical pain from these beatings. Even at a very young age, this was where Albert's masochism perversions began. By 1880, when Albert was 10, his mother had secured a government job and she was able to remove him from the orphanage. By 1882, at only 12 years old, Albert began a relationship with a telegraph boy. And this boy introduced Fish to some really disgusting fetish practices that no children should even be aware of, much less actually be practicing in. And these practices included drinking urine and eating feces. Certain things should be kink-shamed, and that's all I'm going to say, but these were literally kids, and I feel disgusting even mentioning, like, kids and kink in the same sentence. But it's just so much worse that they were practicing these things. I mean, adults shouldn't do it either, but, like, obviously it's, like, worse when it's kids. In his adolescence, Fish started going to public baths, which were a common thing back then because not everyone had plumbing or running water yet, and he would go to watch the other boys undress. And this is what he did most weekends, so he had developed a voyeurism kink at a very young age. He also started a hobby which would continue throughout his life, and this was writing obscene letters to women whose names he had acquired through classified ads in matrimonial agencies. Basically, he would, look in the newspaper and he would find people in the classifieds and he would just randomly choose women to write these really vulgar letters to, because back then the newspaper was the closest thing people had to social media or dating apps, and there were columns where you could take out an ad in the paper looking for a husband or a wife. basically like a Tinder bio, but I would assume that it was much more tame and wholesome back then. And this is how Fish got these women's information. So he was trolling long before the internet was even a thing. In 1890, when Fish was 20 years old, he moved to New York City. This is where he began to engage in male prostitution, and he also began to essay young boys. Most of these boys would be younger than the age of 6. Later in his life, Fish would say that he and a male lover of his once went to a wax museum, and on display in this wax museum was a model of a bisected male private area. And this is where he became obsessed with the mutilation of people's private areas. Now, I get that he had a rough childhood and he was beaten in the orphanage, and maybe some even worse things happened to him there as well, given how young he started devolving into these really sick fetish practices and harming younger boys. Not that these things are any excuse for what he did, because I still believe he knew right from wrong. But the physical harm he faced, coupled with mental illness, which was obviously pretty rampant throughout his family, it seemed to create the perfect storm for this monster to be created. When Fish was 28, his mother arranged a marriage for him to a woman named Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 19 at the time. This wasn't uncommon for this time period for parents, particularly mothers, to sort of push their children into marrying someone they already approved of. Whether it was to secure business relations or just so two families who were already friends could be united through marriage together and hopefully later grandchildren. And this was the case for Albert's marriage. He and Anna ended up having 6 children together, named Anna, Albert, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Obviously, they ended up naming the first son and daughter after themselves. 5 years after he got married, Fish was arrested for grand larceny, which is essentially just theft, and he was incarcerated in Sing Sing prison for a time for this crime. Which, spoiler alert, Sing Sing was also the prison he would later be executed in. Around 1910, Fish would have been 40 years old. He had become a house painter by trade, and his work would take him all over the country. So at this time, he was working in Wilmington, Delaware, where he meets a 19-year-old man named Thomas Kedden. And he takes Thomas back to the boarding room where he was staying, and the two developed a BDSM-style relationship. We don't know if Fish forced Thomas to do these things, but it's thought based on Fish's confessions later on that Thomas was probably intellectually disabled. After 10 days of knowing each other, Albert takes Thomas to an old farmhouse where he tortures him for over 2 weeks. Then Albert eventually tied Thomas up and cut off his male private area. Fish said in his confession, quote, "I will never forget his scream or the look he gave me," end quote. Fish initially intended to kill Thomas and cut up his body and take it home with him. I'm assuming for cannibalistic purposes. But he was worried about the hot weather at the time drawing attention to him, because the body would have decayed faster. So instead, Fish poured peroxide over Thomas's wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, kissed Thomas goodbye, and left him with a $10 bill for his troubles. Fish said after this encounter, he took the first train he could back home, and he never heard what became of Thomas or even tried to find out. Thomas Kedden's fate still remains unknown. We don't know if he ended up dying from the wound, or maybe he was able to get proper medical care but was too afraid to tell anyone what really happened. And he was intellectually disabled, so I mean, he may not have really known or understood what actually happened to him or been able to communicate well with somebody to explain what happened. Over the next 7 years, Fish would continue to have BDSM-style affairs with other men and SA children, but he never actually harmed his own children. They later said that their father never even so much as spanked them. This is kind of how you know he probably knew right from wrong, even though he was definitely mentally ill, because he saw other children as prey, but not his own children. And it almost seems like he was kind of drawing a line at incest. By 1917, after 19 years of marriage and 6 children, Fish's wife Anna left him for a man named John Straub. John had been a handyman who had been renting a room from the Fish family and boarding in their home. Fish said that his wife took almost everything they owned when she left, and he was suddenly stuck all on his own being a single parent to their 6 kids. They didn't have joint custody, she didn't come by to check on them at all, she just up and left. Which, I mean, you would think that maybe she found out about some of the disturbing things Fish had done so far, but if that were the case, like, why would she have left him with the kids? After his wife left, this is when Fish really started to spiral into his mental illnesses, and I'm sure the stress of the situation likely caused things to get worse. So Fish began having auditory hallucinations and possibly visual hallucinations as well. He once wrapped himself in a carpet and said he was following the instructions of John the Apostle, who was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus Christ. He said that God himself was telling him to torture, kill, and essay children, as well as harm himself. He also began to become obsessed with cannibalism, and he started eating raw meat, which he would sometimes feed this to his kids as well. This is also where Fish began to engage increasingly in self-harm. One of the things he would do is stick long needles into his groin, and he would apparently just leave them there, because later on he would have an x-ray done after his arrest, and the doctors and prison staff didn't believe him when he said he had a bunch of needles still in his groin. But yeah, he sure did, and there was a total of 28 left in there that were never removed, by the way. They just left them there through the executions. He would also repeatedly hit himself with this nail-studded paddle he had made, and although he didn't physically harm his own children, he would encourage them and their friends to spank him with this paddle, which was obviously to get, you know, a type of thrill out of it. He was also known to, this is a little funny, okay? So he would also put wooden sticks soaked in lighter fluid into his butt and light them on fire. Like, I'm just imagining that. That's very creepy. So he was obviously getting a masochistic thrill out of all the self-harm he indulged in, which is very rare for a serial killer to have all of these kinks, especially ones that harm themselves. Most of the time, serial killers engage in some form of sadism where they get a thrill out of harming others, but they don't want to be harmed themselves. Unfortunately, self-harm was not the only thing Fish was interested in, and as his mental illness got worse, his crimes would also get worse. Now, at some point, Fish's oldest son, also named Albert, got tired of his bizarre and creepy behavior and threw him out of the family home. This is when Fish became a drifter. So he was practically homeless, but sometimes he would scrape up enough money to rent a room somewhere. This is when Fish got arrested a few more times for minor offenses like vagrancy, petty theft, and sending obscene letters, which I mentioned earlier. This was something he continued to do. It was just this compulsion, and he couldn't stop sending these disgusting, vulgar letters to random women he would find from newspaper ads. Around 1919, Fish would have been almost 50 years old at this time, and he was getting worse with his perversions and delusions. Again, he believed that God was instructing him to harm children. He collected tools to use on his victims, which he called his implements of hell, which were a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. Now, I'm just going to say right here that I'm not a very religious person or anything, but this sounds like demonic possession. Fish would also go after people that he saw as inferior because he believed they wouldn't be missed. So this would often be the mentally disabled, immigrants, black people, and people from really poor socioeconomic standing. Also keep in mind, this was a very different time where people would have multiple children and they weren't taught things like stranger danger because communities often worked together. People knew their neighbors and society as a whole was just more extroverted and closely knit than it is today, which made people more trusting of each other. And Fish really took advantage of this. We know that at least 2 children who were almost victims of Fish managed to evade his grasp, and one was 8-year-old Beatrice Keel. In 1924, Fish went to this farm where he found Beatrice playing alone, because it was her parents' farm. So Fish offers Beatrice money to help him look for some rhubarb in an attempt to lure her away. She was on her way to join him and may have not returned, but her mother saw her about to walk off with this strange man, so she chased Fish away. Later that night, Fish returned to the same farm to sleep in the barn and possibly try again to abduct Beatrice, but this time he was chased away by Hans Keel, Beatrice's father. Another child was Cyril Quinn, who Fish had already been essaying and grooming for some time. Cyril and his friends were playing on a sidewalk when Fish asked if they had eaten lunch. When they said they hadn't, Fish invited the boys to his apartment for sandwiches. The two boys start play wrestling on Fish's bed while waiting for their sandwiches, and while playing on the mattress, they saw several things fall out from under it, which were a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver, also known as Fish's implements of hell. The children became frightened after seeing these things, and they ran out of the apartment. But sadly, Fish did manage to get at least one child in the year 1924. 9-year-old Francis McDonnell was reported missing after he didn't come home from a game of catch with his friends. The other children Francis had been playing with told police that Francis had left with an elderly man with a gray mustache. A neighbor had also seen the two heading into the woods. Francis's mother had also recognized the description of the man because she had seen him hanging out in the area earlier that day. She said he was mumbling to himself and making weird motions with his hands. So a search party was formed to look for Francis, and they end up finding the poor boy's body hanging from a tree in the woods not far from his house. His legs and abdomen were covered in cuts to the extent that his left hamstring had been almost entirely ripped apart. He had also been essayed and strangled with his own suspenders. Due to multiple accounts and descriptions of the abductor as being a faded-looking, gray-haired old man, he became known as the Gray Man in the area. But no one could ever figure out his true identity, and Francis's death remained a mystery until Fish was arrested years later, and Beatrice's parents, as well as Francis's mother, had all identified him as the Gray Man. But Fish would deny it was actually him until over a decade later in 1935 when he finally gave a full confession. He claimed that on top of everything that he had already done to poor Francis, that he had also planned on cutting off the boy's private area, but he ended up fleeing the scene early because he heard people nearby. On February 11th, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in their apartment hallway in Brooklyn, New York, with their 4-year-old neighbor, Billy Gaffney. The 12-year-old ends up leaving to go back to his family's apartment, and in that time both younger boys disappeared. Billy Beaton was later found alive on the roof of the apartments. He himself was seemingly unharmed, but Billy Gaffney was missing. When Beaton was questioned on what happened to Gaffney, he said, "The boogeyman took him." Gaffney's body was never found. Initially, serial killer Peter Kudzinowiski was a suspect in Gaffney's murder. Peter was known to be actively killing during this time in the same geographical area and also went after children. Then Joseph Meehan, who worked at the Brooklyn Trolley, saw a picture of Albert Fish in a newspaper and identified him as the man he saw on February 11th, 1927. He said he saw an old man trying to quiet a little boy on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket, and he was crying for his mother, and was dragged by the man on and off the trolley. Beaton's description of the boogeyman seemed like a match to Fish, and Meehan's description of the child matched Gaffney. Detectives did find out that Fish was employed as a house painter by a Brooklyn real estate company during February of 1927, and the day Gaffney disappeared, he was working at a location a few miles from where the boy was abducted. Later on, when Fish was arrested, he confessed to this crime in a letter to his attorney. And prepare yourselves because this description of the murder and the aftermath is horrifying. He said he brought Billy to the Riker Avenue dumps where there was an abandoned house. He took him into this house, strips Billy nude, tied his hands and feet together, gags him with a dirty rag he picked out of the dumpster. Then he burns his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. He walks back and takes the trolley at 2 a.m. and walks back home from there. Just imagine for a second, like, this is a 4-year-old little boy, and he has been kidnapped, and he's in this house, this abandoned house, alone all night until this man comes back just to torture him. Like, it's pure evil. The next day at 2 p.m., Fish goes back to the house where he's keeping Billy. He took tools, including a cat of nine tails that he had made himself. He said he whipped Billy's bottom until blood ran from his legs. He cut off the boy's ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes, and by this point he was dead, according to Fish. I mean, this is so awful. This little boy has been kidnapped and he's stuck in this house all night by himself, tied up, until this man just gets back to torture and murder him. So then Fish sticks a knife in Billy's belly and he drinks blood directly from this wound. So he's now engaging in vampirism on top of everything else. Fish then picks up 4 old potato sacks and gathers a pile of stones, and he cuts up Billy's body. He ends up keeping the nose, ears, a few slices he cuts off of the belly, as well as the butt and private areas. Fish said he put the parts of Billy that he didn't want for later in the potato sacks, filled them with stones, and threw them into pools of slimy water along the road going to North Beach, where the water is about 3 to 4 feet deep, and they all sink at once. Fish then goes into great detail in this letter about how he cannibalized this child's body, and I'm not going to, read a full description of that, but I will say that it's like he's talking like he's Gordon Ramsay, about how he, puts the carrots and onions and turnips and celery and all that, mixes it into a stew, and he's talking about like literally eating this child's body, and how he puts it in the oven and the temperature. Like, he was real. I hate to say it like this, but it's like he's really good at making these insanely vulgar, horrific letters and putting them all into words. And when you're reading that, you're like, this is not a sane person. This is someone who, honestly, I feel like he was possessed by something, because I've never heard of another person being this obscene before. Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth, went to visit Fish in Sing Sing, accompanied by a detective. She wanted to ask him about her son's death, but Fish refused to speak to her. Then Fish started crying and asked to be left alone. Elizabeth spent 2 hours asking Fish questions through his lawyer, James Dempsey, before she gave up. Mrs. Gaffney still did not believe Fish was actually her son's killer, which I really wonder why, but I mean, maybe she just thought that this guy was crazy and making it up for attention or something. And on top of being a child predator and murderer, Fish was also a bigamist. Although Fish was still legally married to his first wife, Anna, he ended up marrying Estella Wilcox on February 6, 1930 in Waterloo, New York. But they divorced after only a week. There was not really any other information that I could find about Estella or how they met or why they got divorced so quickly, so that's just a bit of a mystery within this case. But I'm really wondering if anyone can find any information about her, please let me know, because I'm just wondering, like, what kind of woman would marry Albert Fish in the state that he was in at this point in his life. Fish was arrested 3 months after the marriage for sending an obscene letter to a woman who answered an advertisement for a maid. He got arrested for sending yet another obscene letter the following year, and he was sent to Bellevue Hospital for observation. Now, I know they still had insane asylums back then, so I'm really wondering, with how obviously mentally deranged this man was and how he kept getting arrested for these letters, that no one ever had him committed. Women would get sent to institutions just for having hysteria, yet Fish was out here doing the most evil and depraved things imaginable and kept getting away with it for decades. But I digress about that. Now, for the last murder, and what finally got him caught. On May 25th, 1928, which was just over a year since Billy Gaffney was killed, Fish finds an ad in the Sunday newspaper that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." 3 days later, on May 28th, Fish, who at this point was 58 years old, like he's getting up there in years, he goes to visit the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense that he was going to hire Edward to work on his farm. Of course, Fish didn't have a farm. He was hoping Edward would be his next victim, and he later confessed his plan was to tie the boy up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. So Fish goes to meet the Budd family, and he introduces himself under the fake name of Frank Howard, and he tells them that he is a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. and Farmingdale seems like a great place for a farmer to be. He promised to hire Edward as well as Edward's friend Willie and said he would send for them in a few days. Fish didn't show up on the date that he said he would, but he does send a telegram apologizing and sets their next meetup for a later date. So on their second meet, he comes to the Budd home and he meets Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd. He also realizes at this point that Edward would not be the best victim choice, as he was a pretty big guy for 18, and he could easily overpower a frail old man like Fish. So he shifts his attention to Grace, and Fish quickly makes up a story about having to go to his niece's birthday party. And this whole time, Fish is hanging out with the family, they're eating lunch. He's clearly manipulating the parents into thinking that he's this successful farm owner who's just a harmless old man looking for young men to help with his farm. So he convinces the parents, Delia and Albert Budd, to let Grace come to his niece's birthday with him that evening, since she would get to have fun with other kids her own age, and he would have her back later that night. And, you know, I feel so bad for the parents, too, because they really were just thinking that this would be a good opportunity for Grace to actually get out of the house and maybe play with girls her own age, because she was usually, you know, at home with her family at this point. But, of course, the birthday party was all a ruse, and once Fish got Grace out of the house and the two were alone, he takes her to an abandoned house, which he had already picked out this house to murder his next victim in. It was all very pre-planned on his part, which is another reason why it's very hard to take a full insanity defense on this case, because it was so premeditated. And he definitely knew what he was doing was wrong, or he wouldn't have tried to cover it up to the parents. This house that he takes her to, it was known as Wisteria Cottage in Irvington, New York. This is where Fish murdered and cannibalized Grace Budd. 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope was arrested as a suspect in Grace's disappearance in September of 1930. He was accused of taking the girl by his estranged wife and ended up doing 108 days in jail before his trial when he was found not guilty. This man ended up being an indirect victim of Fish as well, for being falsely accused of crimes Fish had actually committed. So for several years, Grace's parents had no idea what happened to her. Fish had given them a fake name and a fake address, and it wasn't like today where there's cameras everywhere and digital footprints and DNA, so they didn't have any luck even figuring out the real identity of Frank Howard, who, as far as they know, had just ran off with their youngest daughter, and they'd never seen or heard from either of them again. Then in November of 1934, so over 6 years after Grace went missing, her mother gets a letter in the mail. This was, of course, from Albert Fish, and this letter, even though he didn't put a name or address, ultimately led to his arrest, because as we know, Fish could not stop himself from sending vulgar letters, and this particular letter was him confessing to the murder of Grace and what he did to her. So I'm not going to read this letter in full, but I will sort of summarize what Fish is talking about. So he starts out by talking about a friend of his who was a deckhand on a ship, and he would travel to China. One time he gets stuck in China during a famine, and supposedly meat of any kind was $1 to $3 a pound, which would have been like $35 a pound today. So like literally prices like what today's meat is. So, but anyways, very expensive. So he says that children under 12 were being sent to the butchers for their meat to keep others from starving. And he said this is where his friend acquired a taste for human flesh, and upon coming back to New York, he started stealing young boys for their meat. Of course, Fish goes into a ton of disturbing details about what his friend supposedly did to these boys and exactly how he cut up and ate the meat. Then he gets to the part where he mentions meeting the Budd family, how they had lunch and Grace sat in his lap and kissed him, and that is where he made up his mind to eat her. He says he's taking her to a party, but instead takes her to an abandoned house, and when they get there, he has her remain outside where she stays and picks wildflowers. So this is where he's going into detail about the actual murder in this letter that he sends to Grace's mother. Fish goes upstairs and he removes his clothes so he didn't get blood on them. Then he calls for Grace to come to the window and waits in the closet for her to come upstairs. Grace began to cry upon seeing him naked and tries to run away, but Fish grabs her. He strips her and strangles her while she tries to fight for her life. Fish said he cut up her body to cook and eat it, and that it took him 9 days to eat her entire body, but he says he did not SA her. Now, he goes into a ton of detail about how he prepared this body as well. Again, it's like he's writing a freaking cookbook. It's so just bizarre, and it's like I'm really literally reading about a child being cannibalized and murdered. But at the end of the letter, he was very adamant that, he didn't SA Grace and that she died a virgin, as if that somehow was omitting him from all of the sins that he had just committed. The police investigated the letter and could not verify the story about Fish's friend or that there ever was a famine where children were being eaten in China, but the last part of the letter concerning Grace was accurate in how he described the kidnapping and later events, but it was impossible to confirm whether or not Fish had eaten parts of Grace's body. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small emblem with the letters NYPCBA, which stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, which is such a long, weird acronym. So a janitor for the company told the police that he had taken some of the stationery home but left it at his boarding house, which was at 200 East 52nd Street, when he moved out. The landlady of this boarding house said that Fish checked out of the room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money and he asked her to hold his next check for him. So this is where they figured out that Fish had done it, basically, because of the stationery that they had from the boarding house. It lined up, and he was the last person there. Also, his description definitely matched from the Budd family's description of the man who had taken their daughter. William F. King, the chief investigator for the case, waited outside the room until Fish returned. Upon meeting with Fish, he did initially agree to go in for questioning, but then Fish pulled out a razor blade. King disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters because obviously, I think it's funny because it's like he is this frail old man going after children, and then he actually tries to, kind of bow up and fight this big detective to get away, but obviously, again, you're a frail 58-year-old man. Fish did not deny killing Grace. He even admitted that he originally went to the home to kill her brother Edward. Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11, 1935 in White Plains, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Fish pled insanity, claiming he heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's disturbing fetishes, which included S&M, flagellation, exhibitionism, voyeurism, cannibalism, consuming urine and feces, and attraction to prepubescent children, which we all know what that is, necrophilia, and mutilation. Psychiatrists noted that Fish was a psychiatric phenomenon, and that nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual who possessed so many intimate abnormalities. And I don't think that there ever has been since. I can't think of anyone else, serial killer-wise, who possessed all of these types of traits, like where they were into sadism and self-harm and had all of these different kinks and fetishes on top of that. The defense's expert witness for this case was Frederick Wortham. He was a psychiatrist specializing in childhood development. During his testimony, Wortham explained Fish's obsession with religion and how he seemed to believe that if he sacrificed a boy, it would be penance for his own sins, and that angels would have prevented him from murdering if God didn't approve of it. Edward had been the next intended victim for this sacrifice, but since he was larger than Fish had expected, he settled for Grace. Even though Fish knew Grace was female, he still perceived her as a boy. Wortham said Fish perceived his cannibalism as a sort of communion. The last question asked by Fish's lawyer was 15,000 words long. It detailed Fish's life and ended by asking Dr. Wortham how he considered Fish's mental state based on his life. Wortham simply answered back with 3 words: "He is insane." This honestly should be a movie. This would make a great movie if they kind of left out all of the child murder and stuff and just focused on the actual case. because I can just imagine like the 1930s courtroom. The prosecution cross-examined Wortham on whether he believed Fish knew right from wrong. He said that Fish did know, but it was a perverted knowledge based on his opinions of sin, atonement, and religion, and thus was an insane knowledge of right and wrong. Which I'm not sure how much I agree with that, because like he knew not to murder. He knew not to murder children. No matter how insane he may have been, he knew not to murder those kids. The defense called 2 more psychiatrists who confirmed Wortham's findings on Fish's mental state. Now, none of the 12 jurors had any doubt Fish was insane, but they felt he should be executed anyways. So they found him sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death by execution. In March of 1935, Fish arrived at prison, and he was executed on January 16th of 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. They did way speedier executions back in the day. Now it takes decades, which is ridiculous. He entered the execution chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried at Sing Sing Prison Cemetery. Fish even helped the executioner put the electrodes on his body, and his final words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." One witness to the execution said that it took 2 jolts before Fish died, which created a rumor that all those needles he had inserted in his body years prior short-circuited the electric chair. But this was later found to be untrue because he died in the same time frame as others who had been killed by the electric chair. Fish's lawyer James Dempsey met with reporters after the execution and said that he was in possession of Fish's final statement, which was several pages of handwritten notes that Fish apparently wrote in the hours just prior to his death. When the press had asked Dempsey to reveal the contents of the letters, he said, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." And that's it. That is the case of Albert Fish. If you would like any more particular stories, please let me know. You can find me on Instagram or on TikTok. You're welcome to message me on either platform. And I hope you enjoyed it. Please have a wonderful day and like and subscribe for more.